Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Jacksonville History Show, brought to you by the Jacksonville Historical Society and Comcast. I'm Harry Reagan. Tonight, an interview with George Winterling, TV4's legendary weatherman. We interviewed George Winterling just after he retired with 47 years at Channel 4. Here's George.
When hurricanes come, most people say, well, since I forecast Hurricane Dora, which was the only full-force hurricane to ever hit Jacksonville, they want to know what I think, regardless of who else is reporting the weather. And so Channel 4 decided that they couldn't just let me go completely out of the picture.
Yes. Now, talk a little bit about Dora. That is one of the highlights of your career at Channel 4.
Well, Dora started with, I guess you call her sister, Donna, in 1960. When I was working with the Weather Bureau, Donna was slamming into South Florida, much like a Hurricane Andrew type storm. And we want to know if it was going to come up here, and that's what all the telephone calls were about. And the radio stations want to know what's Donna going to do. And I said, well, forecasts were just simply the bulletins from the Miami Hurricane Center with the local weather office making statements as to what we could expect. They didn't explain what was causing the hurricane to do what, to move this way or that way. And I said, well, after that was finished, I said, really, we needed to go into more detail of what hurricanes are all about. So I said, the television stations called us for our input. I said, meteorologists should be at the TV station to update things, because once the Weather Bureau makes a bulletin or a statement, conditions keep changing. And as that new information comes in, you can't wait for the official word to come out. You want to be in direct contact with the people. And so I went to Channel 4, and I'd never done television before, never even thought about it seriously. And they said, well, you will let you do an audition. And this is when they were located at the south end of Main Street, off the Main Street Bridge. And no videotape. They said, well, we'll get you in the studio, and you get in front of the weather maps, and you do your weather presentation. And so the management and news director and all were sitting there in the darkness of the studio while I did a weather presentation. And I wound it up, and I thought, well, I wonder how I did. And they came up and shook my hand and says, don't call us, we'll call you. And so I said, well, I'll see if somebody else would be interested in getting me a start in television. So WFLA in Tampa was looking for a meteorologist, because Roy Leap was the meteorologist at the other station down there, WTVT. And so WFLA, Farragon was his name. He was the one that wanted me to do an audition down there. And they've said basically the same thing. So I said, well, I've got to brush up and polish up on my presentation. So I spent about a year and a half just practicing, putting a weather map on my wall in my house, and pretending the camera was pointed at me. And so I started getting the spiel of talking about the weather. And
so you had the weather forecasting ability. You had to work on the presentation.
The terminology, because I'd find you'd be reaching for words. You didn't know how to explain things, or you might find yourself repeating certain phrases. So you had to polish that up. In fact, I would even practice when I was driving down the road, looking out the window and seeing the cumulus clouds. And I said, well, there's beautiful blue skies, but you have a thunderhead building over here to the south. And up until then, it was just meteorological, clear sky, broken clouds, visibility 7 miles, and ceiling 2,500 feet.
You had done some radio.
Yes.
Before this.
When I worked at the Weather Bureau, the local radio station, WJAX, which was a city-owned station, every 6 hours at noon, at 6, and 11 o'clock at night, they would go to the Weather Bureau for the latest weather information. And so they would pitch it to me. We had to be sitting in front of the microphone, and most of the forecasters just got a weather summary that the Weather Service printed on their printer and just read it and then read the forecast. Well, we had one forecaster, Rex Roten was his name. He just took the big weather map and stood in front of it and started talking about, well, we see a cold front coming down from Chicago, and we expect it to be in our area in a couple of days. And so our forecast will be showers and thunderstorms with the wind shifting and temperatures dropping into the 40s or the 30s. And so he did the ad lib type weather forecast. So I modeled what I was doing after him. So the radio gave me some experience there. And,
so at some point, Channel 4 did call you, I guess, or you went back to them.
I went back, and they were rather non-committal because I was an untried product on TV. Mm. And they were used to trying people who said they were meteorologists, but some of them just had a few weather courses.
Well, talk about that. The early days of weather forecasting on TV, there was no professionalism, no expertise, no credentials. Mm. It was just someone who was an announcer reading a weather forecast or something.
They were usually either an announcer or sometimes a news person would fill in. But John Douglas was an announcer. He did the forecast. Norm Davis did some of the weather broadcasts when our first meteorologist left Channel 4.
Norm, who went on to do editorials and so forth. But,
he was widely known for editorials and working with investigative reporting. When I got the job at Channel 4, that I wasn't just going to say there's scattered showers around. I got a camera I bought from a pawn shop on Main Street, and I'd disappear from the TV station and drive, sometimes with the water up to the hubcaps in the car, which you're not supposed to do these days, and would shoot films of the water rising, going up toward the doorsteps, come back, process the film, and put it in the weather report.
And we have to keep in mind that was film, which had to be processed and edited before it could go on the air, unlike today's videotape and so forth.
And I think about the most disappointing thing that would ever happen is if you go out into a severe weather thing like that, and you come back and you open the camera and find out that your film had run out on the reel, and you didn't catch the pictures.
Yeah. Well, the tools that you use today to present the weather and to forecast the weather have come so far, because that audition, and in the early days when you were working at Channel 4, it was kind of magic markers on a big sheet of paper, wasn't it?
We had to construct everything that visually went on the air. It was a paper map, a magic marker. Some places use a plexiglass where they could just wipe it off. We used the fresh paper map each time. We couldn't use white paper on the maps. They were a light blue. But I noticed one thing that I had noticed that the first satellite pictures, which started in 1960 with the Tyros satellite, I saw some of those pictures of the clouds and the patterns. And so when I started doing this light blue map, I said, well, instead of just drawing lines with a cold front and a warm front and isobars, I'll paint the clouds on with white paint. So the white paint looked like it was raised up from the map. And that started in 1962, and that was a regular part of the weather forecast, actually up until the computers took over.
When you were growing up, you grew up in Jacksonville.
Yes.
Not born here.
No, I was born in New Jersey.
And at what point did you decide what your career choice was going to be?
Well, I always was interested in watching the aircraft. I watched the history of aviation unfold here in Jacksonville. When I first came here, the yellow biplane Stearman trainers were up there in formation and circling the airport and landing and taking off.
That would be Amundsen Airport.
No, that was at Jacksonville Naval Air Station.
Oh, I see. Okay, right.
The Navy training these, and many of them, of course, went off into the war. Went down the St. Johns River on the bulkhead, where now there's all beautiful homes. It was just a bulkhead with undeveloped property in Venetia. because it was planned to develop back in the days of the Depression and then before the Depression. And when the Depression came, all these streets and curbs and sidewalks were there, but very little construction. So I'd go down to the riverfront and I'd watch the PBY planes practice landing and taking off. And I thought, gee, that must be fun, flying these planes and landing and taking off. And then I'd watch them up in the clouds coming back from their target practice over the ocean and see them going around the banks of the cumulus clouds. And I said, that must be fun being up there instead of down here looking up. So I wanted to be a pilot. Well, when I finished high school, I went to the first the Navy, and they said, no, well, you have to have some college before you get your flight training. And so I went to the Air Force, and they said, well, it says you can join the Air Force, and then you can get into the cadet program after basic training. Well, after basic training, they said you have to go to a trade school for short term. And I saw on the list of the things there, of all the things they offered me, and it was anything from mechanic to radio operator to navigator. And then at the bottom was weather. Back in those days, they didn't teach us weather in high school, in grade school. And I said, well, I always wondered how they forecast the weather. So I went to weather school. And when I went there, it changed my life. I could never walk outside and look at the sky again without knowing what was going on and wanting to know more, what was beyond what I could see.
Okay, so 4 years in the Air Force, and then FSU, Florida State University?
Yes. Now, when I got out of the Air Force, I came back to Jacksonville why did I come back to Jacksonville? I guess it wasn't the term had already started at FSU. So I went and checked in at Jacksonville Junior College. And so I went there for 1 year and then transferred to Florida State University. And when I went to Florida State University, they offered meteorology there. And the Air Force had sent me to school in Oklahoma State, for a meteorology course for their Air Force forecasters. And so when I went to Florida State, I told them I have 55 hours of meteorology at Oklahoma State. Well, they looked over the courses I'd taken. They said, well, you'll have to take our courses. We won't allow you credit for them. So I got a double dose of meteorology when I went to Florida State. I was always interested in photography. When I was in junior high, I got into even before that, I got a baby Brownie Kodak camera when I was only in the second grade, and I was always snapping pictures. And then when I got into junior high, I learned about the photography and development, and so I went and developed my own film. So it was very interesting to develop your film and learn the process. And so then when the movie cameras came to be the thing, I bought a camera from Sears called a tower camera, had a little lever on it, and you can snap one picture at a time on your roll of movie film. So I said, well, I'm going to do this. And I tried it shooting at the cloud and clicking one frame at a time. I was doing a time lapse showing the clouds, just doing their various formations. So when I got the job at Channel 4, I said, well, they're starting film on their newscast. I'll get a camera and where I can do the same thing.
Because the early newscasts, this would be true of news, weather, and sports, there weren't many pictures. It was basically an anchor or someone talking heads. There wasn't a lot of film or photos or anything available in those days.
Polaroid was about the quickest thing. In fact, they had a rear screen projector behind our newscast where they would insert these slides that were about 2 by 4 inches into that projector, and it'd be projected on a screen behind the news anchor of a shot of the news scene. And so that was the first visuals there until the film developing process came to the TV station.
And people who have been around, who've been in Jacksonville for a while, will remember that for a long, long time, there was the basic group of Bill Grove, George Winterling, and Dick Stratton doing news, weather, and sports. And it was, talk a little bit about some of those people that you worked with in the early days.
Well, we had a big news team started in 1962 when our news expanded. It used to be just a 15-minute newscast, local newscast, 5 minutes of news, 5 minutes of sports, 5 minutes of weather.
So that happened when you came on board?
When I first came in 1962. It was from 6:30 to 6:45. And then the CBS News came on for a 15-minute newscast. And so that was in June of 1962. In September of that year, CBS expanded to a 30-minute newscast. So we expanded our local news to a full half hour. And with a full half hour of local news, I had 2 weathercasts in that half hour of news. And so we split it up. I did the first one in the beginning of the news, which was a national weather. And then toward the end of that local news, I did the local weather. And so we expanded the news there, and we had all kinds of reporters. We'd have a medical reporter, someone who came in, I believe he was a Navy man, and I guess he was somewhere in either a doctor or so. He would do some medical news. We had a business reporter, and then we had a team of them that came, Ron Johnson and Ernie Mastriani and Bruce Hall. And turned out the very last thing in the newscast was the latest report on the stock market. Well, this would be reported from the newsroom. Well, we were in the studio, so we could never see who was doing that. So, well, just before I did the weather, they say, all right, today, Ron Johnson's doing the stock market report. And then the next day they say, Bruce Hall is doing it. And then the next day they say, Gordon Robbie is doing it. Well, one night I did the weather, and all of a sudden I forgot who was doing it. And I said, well, now we go for the latest stocks. There's the old, what's his name?
You're watching an interview with George Winterling on the Jacksonville History Show. More of our interview after this. So you pioneered some of these innovations of how to present weather on TV.
Yes, more or less out of necessity, because I just did not like a static map, and I did not like to see weather people point to a line and say, well, this front is moving that way, and they'd be pushing like that line is supposed to move. I said, well, if it's going to move that way, why don't you make it move that way? And so I did that on film.
You also did some teaching at Jacksonville University.
I taught twice in Jacksonville. I almost forgot about that. There was a teacher strike back in the 1960s, and the TV station, Glenn Marshall, had suggested that while the teachers were on strike and the schools were still open, they wanted volunteers to go and teach. So I taught a math class over in Arlington Junior High as either math or science. But that was just for a short term, a month or two. Then in 1975, Jacksonville University wanted me to teach their meteorology class. And so I taught meteorology there for 17 years.
While you were still working at Channel 4?
Yes. I worked in the evenings at Channel 4, so I would go to Jacksonville University from 9 until 11. One time I had 2 classes because everybody wanted to enroll in the meteorology class.
And I suppose the curriculum and what you were teaching had changed a lot since your days of going to those same kinds of classes at FSU.
Yes, in fact, I got the latest textbooks from these book companies, and so when some of the latest books and they got very visual with the advance of color and printing processes that I could keep up with, the cloud seeding and the study of hurricanes and what they've learned about tornadoes with their computer studies. And so I kept up with a lot of the advances just by teaching.
Still a good career, meteorology.
It is. It's very fascinating. It's changed. It's not the hands-on like we had to take the raw numbers off of a printer and put them on a piece of paper on a chart and draw the lines and analyze it. Now the computer, zip, it's analyzed. So we don't have to go through the meticulous analysis that we did back then. And we didn't have the big gaps in weather data because the weather satellites show the entire Earth. And back then, we had to depend on ships sending individual reports. And there were big gaps. And hurricane hunters had to go fly over vast thousands of miles of ocean waters to see if there is a storm out there. And so now it's so fascinating that everything comes in through the computer. And in addition to that, now we have the computer models that used to be just the equations that we had in college. Now the computer models have been processed into creating the pictures of the clouds and particularly depicting the weather rather than just showing numbers. One big change has been back when I first started, people said, "Oh, you're a weatherman." Says, "You always get it wrong." They always remembered that.
They remember those forecasts.
They remember those. And actually, when I first started, you couldn't forecast more than 2 days in advance. Anything beyond that is really up for grabs. But now
you might as well be using the Farmer's Almanac for that.
Well, that's where the Farmer's Almanac was so popular. And the only thing we could do is go by what we call climatology, of what normally happens that time for the season, but not any specific weather.
But now with a greater degree of reliability, you can go for 7-day forecasting.
Yes, the 7-day, and there's always that uncertainty about 7 days, especially if something enters the picture, like a hurricane that was not there when you first made the 7-day forecast. If one popped up on the third day, then that would change the forecast the last 3 days in some respects. But the computers have been able to, and plus the satellites filling in all the data over these unknown regions of the Earth.
47 years at the same station may be a record. If we look, we might find one that was more, but that's very impressive.
They're very, very few. Most of them are, especially at the same station.
Yes.
Because I know a few that have been at different stations. Harry Volkman in Chicago.
Who've continued broadcasting.
But he just retired about 2 years ago. He was 80 years old when he retired and had a very distinguished career, starting off in Oklahoma City, which was a big tornado area. And of course.
And I suppose you may have considered other offers from time to time.
Well, David Letterman started off as a weatherman.
Exactly. But even to go and forecast weather somewhere else, because the question I was going to get at was forecasting weather may be more interesting in some parts of the world than others. The weather may be more interesting there. And so how does Northeast Florida, you wanted to stay in Northeast Florida for various reasons, maybe not just because of the weather, but is Northeast Florida just kind of interesting from a weather forecaster point of view?
Well, I think the one thing is weather is something that kind of grows on you. And the more you experience it, the more background you have into it. In fact, we had a meteorologist, Rufus Hafer, and a lot of times he would be working during the day, and I'd come in about 2 or 3 in the afternoon to take over from him. And he had been forecasting one thing, and as soon as I walked in the door, and I said, "Well, this is going to happen," and he would be very perturbed. He said, "Here, you just walk in the door and you tell me something about the weather, and I've been looking at it all day long, and I don't see it."
And that's because you had a lot of longevity in this part of the world?
Yes, because I could almost feel and could see what was transpiring. And the same thing with hurricanes. A lot of the newcomers that are not experienced with tropical storms and hurricanes, they'll see a hurricane that's down in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic Ocean, and they'll say, well, I'm concerned. I want to be sure it's not coming this way. Well, I'll see right away that here's a front coming, and it's going to turn that, and see the jet stream's going to come, and it's going to pick it up.
I think what a lot of people saw all these years when you're on the air is your passion for what you do. You really seem to enjoy it. And I guess everybody should be so lucky. But you do seem to have made the right career choice, and it's something that you really enjoyed for a long, long time and still enjoy.
Well, I've kind of come from a long line of people who have had similar experiences. Hurricane Center has had Gordon Dunn and Bob Simpson and people who have grown with meteorology.
And they were passionate about it.
They're passionate.
Yeah.
Grady Norton was the old timer. In fact, an interesting highlight of Jacksonville is that the Hurricane Center used to be started right here in Jacksonville, Florida, before it went to Miami. But I found that in television, I had spent most of my time not just reporting the weather on TV, but going to Palatka and Lake City and St. Augustine, St. Simons and Fernandina and Folkestone and Hilliard and different places where people are, and meeting with them and answering their questions and explaining to them the facts about the weather.
And we thank WJXT for recording and editing the interview with George. We'll be doing more of these oral histories this year. And that's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. For more information, contact the Jacksonville Historical Society at 665-0064 or visit the website, jackshistory.com. So long, everyone.